Hello and welcome. Today we have with us a very special guest, Dr. Manjula O'Connor. Dr. O'Connor is a renowned clinical psychiatrist who focuses primarily on the mental health issues of women affected by sexual and gender-based violence. She has worked across a range of sociocultural communities, from the Mediterranean ethnic groups to South Asian groups. Dr. O'Connor is also the founding director of the Australasian Center for Human Rights and Health, which works for women affected by dowry-related abuse by organizing really well-curated campaign activities and other events. The organization has also helped workshops with communities in India. She has also been the vice president of the Australia-India Society of Victoria to work for the themes of mental health and gender equality. Dr. O'Connor is also a member of the Australian government's South Asian Communities Ministerial Advisory Council to develop responsive mechanisms on issues and challenges facing the South Asian community in Australia. Dr. O'Connor, I'm really happy that you're with us today, and I'd like to welcome you and thank you right at the outset for taking the time to be with us through your busy schedule.
Thank you so much for having me. And I am so happy to be here because I do want that Australia and India communication should stay completely up to date as far as these issues are concerned, that is mental health and gender equality and gender equity.
Absolutely. We were discussing earlier, there's a lot of focus and a lot of now new renewed interest in this very strategic sort of relationship between India and Australia, but a lot of focus also is on security issues and things like that. Whereas, mental health and, what really niche areas like this that the diaspora has to maybe face is also as important as anything else. So let me start by asking you about your center, the Australasian Center for Human Rights and Health. How did this organization come about, and what was the space that you wanted to capture?
So the center was established in 2012, and it was essentially to capture the issues around gender-based violence and dowry abuse and gender inequality, gender inequity with the South Asian communities. I wanted to focus on the South Asian communities because, firstly, because I'm Indian and I understand that culture really well, but also because this was a group that was not being served well by the then government policies and healthcare provisions. And a lot of the time, the domestic violence service providers did not quite understand the complexity of family dynamics of an Indian or a South Asian family. So, because as we all know, we love our families. Family is absolutely the central core of our lives, and they are most life-giving and supporting. But at the same time, the same family can be very toxic if there are, some members who choose to play power politics or other forms of abuse. And it was something that the governments did not understand, that you can have an abuse, a domestic abuse at the hands of a husband, but equally important could be the domestic abuse by female relatives as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we wanted to highlight those kind of issues, but also not just to change the policy and the healthcare providers' knowledge, but also to help the community understand itself as to what it is going through, and individual women as well. So there were a number of aims we had in mind when we started this process?
That seems like a very sort of comprehensive sort of agenda, but you have also been known to have a special focus and really be at the forefront of finding relief for victims of dowry abuse. You've led a relentless campaign, and people know you through the kind of campaign that you've led against the practice of dowry. What led you to take on this goal of gender-based empowerment through abolition of dowry?
So it was 2008 when I started to see international students, Indian international students in my psychiatry clinic. They were coming with mental health issues like anxiety and depression. And in those consultations, there was one particular woman who told me that she'd been through a huge amount of abuse at the hands of her husband and her sister-in-law in Melbourne, demanding gold and money and her cash that she was earning, in spite of the fact that they'd been given a lot of dowry back in India when she had got married. And I saw that, yes, it obviously rang bells because we've heard about those stories all our life in India. And I had no idea that this could be happening in Australia. And so she said to me that you'll be surprised how common a problem this is. And sure enough, then I saw a string of women come along saying the same kind of problems, that if they did not comply with the demands of more cash, gifts, gold, and even gifts to be given back in India to their families, to their in-laws by their parents, if that didn't happen, they would go through domestic abuse, emotional abuse, and if she was too, cocky and answered back, then that would lead to violence. And of course, there was the associated financial abuse that meant that everything she earned belonged to the husband. And so it started to look like a pattern to me, that it was a very similar pattern to that found in India. And over the next 3-4 years, I saw repeatedly this issue amongst my patient who were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders, depressive disorders as a result of this kind of abuse. And I started then a campaign to say that we need a similar law in Australia, similar to the one we have in India, so that we can at least give the women some support from, legal structures, and that it needs to be recognized as a real issue. This is not simply 1 or 2 people. And so we started the campaign at that time in 2012 with a petition. We started a petition. We wanted the South Asian community to sign the petition to say that dowry abuse should be included under a family, what's it called? We call it a Family Violence Protection Act of Victoria. It should go under the economical abuse section as an example of economical abuse as a dowry abuse. And we ran a very strong campaign of South Asian community writing, signing those the petitions, and they were tabled in the Parliament by the former Premier of Victoria on 2 separate occasions with 2 separate sets of signatures. And alongside, we also started to speak with the parliamentarians, to the local MP, I even met the Premier and a number of MPs and the opposition, and they all supported what we were doing, because when I would go to meet them, I made sure that I took actual victim survivors with me, that it wasn't my word. They just had to listen to the women coming from their mouth to hear the trauma they were going through, at being criticized, humiliated, put down, name called, vulgar words, at not being able, for not complying with the demands. And at the same time, as we did that, we also started to get significant backlash and resistance from the patriarchal structures of our own community. And so they started to say there is no such problem. I was making it up, and that it was for my own publicity. It was to get more patients for my clinic. It was, in one of the articles, one man said, she has her own issues. I don't know what issues I have. So they tried very hard to stop it, but the law went through in 2019, March 2019.
That's just literally, I have goosebumps just listening to this, that, this is the kind of gaslighting that could go on with somebody who's trying to, improve a community. There's so many questions that come to my head from the story that you've told me. Is this practice limited to the Indian Australian community, or does it extend to other communities? Number two, how deep do you think is this problem in the Indian Australian community? And what happens to these girls? Because they're obviously really far away from home and they're in a new country, and I'm not sure if all of them are financially independent. What happens to them? Do they come back mostly? Do they stay on? It's just incredible.
Yeah, the problem is so complex. It's so multi-layered. So if you start with, firstly, your first question, is it just the Indian community? All of South Asian communities have this dowry problem. But just looking at the financial abuse, that is controlling someone's joint account and controlling their individual account, and removing her salary in order to send money back to India or back home, or using it for their own purposes. It is common across many communities. It's not just the South Asian. Financial abuse is something that is very common, and it is becoming more and more recognizable, because there is more research coming out to show how the financial abuse actually takes place, and how a lot of the young women don't even recognize it as abuse, because it is considered to be it's a family wealth, isn't it? So everyone, so both husband and wife they join together, they earn together, they are trying to create a family wealth, they're trying to create a family home, they're going to buy a house, they're going to have children. So, it's not that difficult to imagine how women would say, okay, of course, I'll put all my income into the joint account, right? In goodwill and in good faith that the husband will do the right thing. But then this is where the abuse starts, is when that money is used only for his benefit and his family's benefit, and not for hers. So I just recently saw a woman from Sri Lanka with exactly the same problem. Right, so she can't send money home to her parents because they are sick and they need her money, but he's allowed to send that money to his
But
parents.
she's earning in
She's
Australia.
earning. That's her money we're talking about.
My God.
So this is, and a lot of the times, it's based on our culture that says that when a daughter gets married, she belongs to the in-laws family, you know, that she no longer belongs to her parents' home. And so on that principle, the men work on that principle that she now belongs to him and that he can do whatever is required in order to maintain that control over her life. And that even not being allowed to let her talk to her mother or father back home, and not allowed to send any money. And so we've had, there's a lot of violence that happens because of those money issues.
Wow. You are a psychiatrist, and I'd like to ask you how that really factored into dealing with victims. How?
So the victims come to me because they impact on their mental health. So many women, in fact, I published the audit of my patient group. Nearly 70% of women were suicidal when that's how they come to me.
Tragic.
Yeah, and at least 17% of women had attempted serious suicide. And most of these women are suffering extreme panic attacks, nightmares. They haven't often slept for weeks on end. They haven't eaten for weeks on end. They are so underweight and so undernourished. They're often anemic. All of them have menstrual problems. Their physical health is really bad, and the low in vitamins and iron and folic acid. That's the condition I see them in. And you can ask how domestic violence can do so much trouble is because a lot of those women that I see, they are generally highly educated women. They are generally working, and they are not going to put up with the abuse. They talk back. They resist the violence. They resist being controlled by the husband or by the other family members, particularly mother-in-laws and brother-in-laws. And, so they resist, and that's when they get, they receive a lot of abuse, physical violence, and then they're abandoned. And so we have a lot of abandoned wives in Australia, and these are women who have nobody else here, or if they do, it could be a cousin or an uncle, distant cousin or something, who they're not enough to support her to going through this such tough time, and so they effectively are alone. And they're suffering so much stigma in their mind, shame of a failed marriage, feeling like a failed person, and so worried about their parents' well-being, mental health, physical health. They're worried about the fact that parents have given so much dowry, spent so much money on their marriage. They're worried about if they go back to India as a divorced woman, what kind of future they'll ever have. Do you know the number of problems the women face is absolutely huge.
Staggering.
And that's not all. A lot of the time, the visas, the sponsorship visa gets canceled. And so then, and when we started this campaign, the immigration department would deport the women. I have seen so many stories of international students' wives being sent back home to India because the husband withdraw their sponsorship. And those women went back to India with nothing in their hand. And some of them still write to me from India after years. So basically, we have now stopped that. So part of our reason for existence is to change policy. So we work with the immigration department to change this policy so that women cannot be deported back just because he said he's canceled the visa. And so now the women, if they stay connected with us and have knowledge of the system, they have 28 days to lodge a complaint of domestic violence on the website, and they then get to stay in the country whilst their claim is processed. And even if they're deported back, they still have 28 days to come back. So, we've been able to create that change. So a lot of the women I know are now not going back. And if they do go back and they do stay on because they don't have knowledge and they don't attend our sessions to learn about these things, if they somehow connect with me, I can help them to come back on the basis of, this is called exit human trafficking.
Mm-hmm.
And human trafficking is illegal in the whole world.
Correct.
And so this is called exit human trafficking. So the husband has tricked the woman into going back under false pretenses when it should not have been, it should not have been possible for him to send her back. But he tricked her, he brainwashed her thinking and telling her, if he doesn't support her, the government will not have her here. They will take her, they will drag her by her hair back to the country. The stories that I hear. So the most awful stories. And, I'm so glad to say that a lot of the women I see, we are able to get them their permanent residency and they get to stay on and start a new life.
My God, it's incredible from what I hear. One would think that people living in, other countries, advanced countries, these things would sort of dissipate with the kind of environment that you live in, but clearly not. And it's amazing the work that you do, because it clearly hasn't been easy, but luckily they have a center to go to, sort of have some support. But I'd like to now shift the attention to your book as well. You've written a book called Daughters of Durga.
Yes.
How does this book relate to the gender-based violence in communities in Australia? What is it about? What prompted you to write?
Yeah, so Daughters of Durga, I wanted to show that we, as our Indian culture, civilization, we are a very ancient and highly evolved culture and civilization, going back some 5,000 to 7,000 years, where we had, Sanskrit was the almost the first complex language of the world. And we have, science of medicine and dentistry and astrology, astronomy and physics and chemistry and all kinds of sciences. And that during those early years of our culture, women were they were revered, they were, obviously respected greatly. Otherwise, we would not have the goddesses that we do. So if you look at, Saraswati or Saraswati, the goddess of knowledge and education, and the Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth and happiness, and Parvati, the calmness, the calm goddess, but it's various avatars like Durga and Kali, who are the power behind Shiva, and we have, you know, Sita and Radha and so many other forms of goddesses, that you cannot have that many goddesses without a culture that respected and that valued them. And it was not it was still a patriarchal culture, but not in a way that was dominant and abusive of women, in a way that the patriarchy became after Manusmriti. So the Manusmriti, I date a lot of the deterioration in our attitudes towards women in the Manusmriti, so that was written about 1,000 years ago now. And in that, there are verses that if you read them, you feel embarrassed to know that you are an Indian person. Like, a woman is a lascivious woman. She has no control over her sexual urges. She will launch at a man. Then the other one, that a husband must be worshipped no matter what he does. But if she does anything wrong, then she must be punished. That, you know, if she does all the housework and keeps her husband happy, she will go to heaven, you know, and that she is not, a woman is not able to think independently, that when she's with her father, she must be dominated by her father or by her brother, and in the husband's house must be dominated by the husband. And if she is, if she is back chats, she must be beaten, and, you know, awful stuff that obviously changed the attitude towards women in such a way that it diminished them as human beings. And then you add to that culture this problem that a daughter does not belong to her father's house once she gets married. So imagine that concept, and the daughter has been handed over to her husband and the in-laws, like Kanyadan. Now, if you have handed over Kanyadan, not Kanyadan, that you have effectively donated your daughter to the other side.
Correct.
If you have that attitude, and that Kanya who comes to Australia and has now been abandoned by the husband's family, she doesn't belong to the father's family. What should she do? Where should she go?
Correct.
And so the women, they stay in abusive relationships, trapped until, you know, their mental health deteriorates to such a severe extent that they can no longer think straight and look after themselves, and they feel suicidal. And so we actually, 2 years ago, we had 7 women in a row who killed themselves in a
God, that's a huge number.
Yeah, in a period of 10 months. And most of those women had domestic violence going on at home.
Wow. Well, you know, Dr. O'Connor, it's incredible. I mean, the kind of work that you're doing, the kind of support that your center has provided these girls. And, you know, this is an eye-opener for me, because like I said earlier, that, one always feels that as you move to Western countries or you move to, more advanced countries, things like this sort of don't happen or take place, but clearly not. And, it's just commendable that there is an organization like this that can extend support on multi-levels, psychological, legal, and I really want to thank you. We're running out of time. Otherwise, I could have spoken so much more about this to you. But I really want to thank you. It was really insightful and truly a deep dive into the problems faced by women in, Australia. And thank you for being here with us. And I'm going to pick up your book because, it resonated a lot with what, we think here, as well as, like you said, that, we have so many great examples of women with strength, and yet there are things like this that happen. So, congratulations on your book. Thank you for being here and being a part of the series of interviews that we are doing for key people who have contributed significantly, like yourselves, in strengthening the India-Australia relationship. I would
Thank
love
you.
to have you on again. Thank you so much.